Um, so first, I want to talk a little bit about the book Atomic Habits by a man named James Clear. Are you guys familiar with this book? Okay. So Atomic Habits is a book that is about, if you can see the title there. So Atomic Habits, James Clear. James Clear, he's a brilliant writer. He has done a lot of research on this topic, and he has come up with this idea of atomic habits. So atomic habits, what he means by it is tiny little habits, small little things that are easy to do, that we can do over time that build up better results in the long term, right? So part of that is he kind of goes into the idea of this, expecting immediate results, and anything that we do in our life is probably a little bit misguided, right? Better results come over time, sort of baby steps. And that's effectively what the idea of atomic habits is. And he uses he has this little math that he puts to it to sort of show you what the impact is. And so he says that a 1% change, anything that you do, if you make a 1% improvement every single day for a year, by the time you get to the end of that year, you will have improved yourself 37 times. And what this is basically, it's the mathematics of compound interest, right? So if you think of saving money in the bank, right, you put in $1. If you're earning 1% interest in the first day, then the second day you have $1.01, right? And then if that's getting 1% interest, by the third day, you have, $1 and 1.15 cents, because you're accumulating that compounding. And so it's the same thing. So for example, let's say that you are a runner and you want to improve yourself running. So if let's say you run a 8-minute mile, a 1% improvement from one day to the next might be a 7-minute, 58-second mile, right? So that's a very small improvement from one day to the next. But if you continue to improve that 1% for a full year, by the time you get to the end of the year, you're going to be running a 4-minute mile, right? So same idea. And we can apply this to I like to apply this to, say, relationships, for example. So let's say that you are in a relationship that's not a great relationship. And let's say that in any given day, you have 10 negative interactions, with this person. If you make a 1% improvement in that, so let's say the next day you have 9 negative interactions, and then you have 8 negative interactions. And so you're making these tiny improvements. By the time you get to the end of the period, then you have a wonderful relationship. And so it's this idea that can be applied to just about anything. And I think it's really brilliant, because what it does is, one of the reasons that we fail at our goals, and one of the reasons that we fail at habit change, is because it's so difficult and it can seem so insurmountable, right? So if you want to lose 50 pounds, that is a huge undertaking. But if instead you say to yourself, I'm just going to lose 1 pound, right? And then the next day I'm going to lose 1 pound. And then the next day I'm going to lose 1 pound. It makes it much more consumable, makes it a lot easier. So it's a much better way, I think, of thinking about changing your behaviors. So what Clear says is that by understanding how our habits work, that we can change our bad habits, and we can more easily change our bad habits and more easily build good habits, right? Because habits he calls it a double-edged sword, right? There are good habits and there are bad habits. And in the same way that incremental change can be good, it can also be bad. So if we are in a bad habit, and if we're making 1% changes in the wrong direction, you have the same effect, right? So you can very easily get to 30 times worse as you can get to 30 times better. So the importance in understanding how habits work is going to be a key part of your success in changing behavior and getting better results in your life. He also talks about goals and the futility of goals. So I want to be clear, I'm not poo-pooing goals altogether, but I do want you to consider changing the way that you think about goals, because I think in our common culture and society, we tend to be very goal-oriented, right? I can't tell you the number of times, and I'm sure this is true for everybody, we've all been told, well, what are your goals? You got to have goals. You can't accomplish anything without goals. How can you expect to get this thing or that thing if you don't have any goals? You got to have goals. You got to have goals. We're very goal-oriented. But the truth is that goals, if you think about what a goal is, a goal really is just a direction, right? It's just a place to get to. The goal itself has nothing to do with how you get there, right? The goal is not going to help you achieve the goal. The goal is just a target, but it doesn't speak at all to how you get to that target. And so what he emphasizes is, rather than be so goal-oriented in our thinking, we should instead, sort of consider minimizing the importance that we place on goals and instead focus on the system. That is the process that is going to get us to the goal. And he gives a lot of really good reasons to do this. He says, because it is the system, right? The system that you have for running every day, putting your shoes on, getting out of the house at a certain time of day, whatever system you have behind, let's say running, if you want to run a marathon, that system is going to get you to complete the marathon, not just the fact that you want to complete the marathon. And so he says that it's much better to invest your mind in the system instead of the goal. So now what is the system, right? Well, the system is really just your habits. So systems are supported by the habits that you have. And this comes back to, so we kind of come full circle now, we've come back to the importance of the habits. And so one other kind of thing to remember about habits is, again, going back to, it's important to know how habits work. He gives the example of an ice cube. And he says, if you were to sit an ice cube out onto a table in a room that is 22 degrees Fahrenheit and it's slowly warming up, right? If the room is warming up from 22, as the room warms up from 22 degrees to 23 degrees, nothing happens to the ice cube. When it goes from 23 degrees to 24 degrees, still nothing happens to the ice cube, right? And so on and so on. So by the time you get to 31 degrees, the room might be thinking, I'm doing all this work to warm up the room and the damn ice cube won't melt, right? But then as soon as it gets to 32 degrees, the ice cube starts to melt, right? And so it's this idea that small incremental change doesn't necessarily yield results along the way, but it does get you to the result, right? So it's just kind of a different way of thinking about it that I really like. He also talks about, so again, to the problems with goal orientation, right? So as I said before, the goal doesn't get you to the destination. Goal doesn't speak to that. It's really the system. There's a few other things about goals that I would ask you to keep in mind. One thing is, he says goals don't differentiate between winners and losers. And what he means by that is, you can take sports, for instance. So, the NBA finals, right? There's always a team that's going to win. And it's easy for us to think, well, that team had really good goals. But the thing about it is the team that lost also had the same goal, right? There isn't any difference in goal setting between the winners and the losers. They both have the same goals. What's different between them is their system and the processes underneath it, right? So again, it's that idea that we tend to think the goal gets us to win. It's not the goal that gets us to win. The second thing is, he says, is so achieving the goal is only momentary. And what he means by this is he gives an example of, say, keeping a messy room. So if your room is messy and your goal is to have a clean room, then you can go and you clean the room, right? And that's fine. You have a clean room for a short period of time. But what's going to happen is the room is going to get messy again, right? So here he emphasizes the importance of the system, because if your system is to keep a tidy room as opposed to cleaning the room periodically, you're never going to have to clean the room to begin with, right? So the system is more important. The goal is only momentary. He also talks about goals restricting happiness. And so, for example, if I have a goal to stop eating cookies, or if I have a goal to, run a marathon, whatever the goal is, I'm not really going to be happy until I reach the goal. So in the process of reaching the goal, while I get there, I am not necessarily in a state of happiness. I'm not necessarily in a positive mindset, because all I know is I'm working to get to the goal, and I think that it's the goal that's going to make me happy. He says, instead of focusing on the goal, if you would focus on the system, right? So now if I can just sit in happiness with my system, develop a good system, a reliable system, one that I know I can pursue regularly with good habits, then I should take my satisfaction and draw my happiness from the fact that I have a good system. And in that scenario, my mind doesn't care whether I ultimately hit the goal or not, because I have disassociated my happiness from the goal, and instead I have created and I've associated my happiness with the system. The last thing he says about this is that goals tend to break long-term progress, right? So I'm going to come back to the marathon example for this. So back when I was in my 20s, which was quite some time ago, when I was in my 20s, I ran a marathon, and I ran it with my at the time my girlfriend, and we trained together for probably 6 months leading up to the marathon. And in those 6 months, I was in great shape, right? I was eating well. Obviously, I was getting the exercise. I was training. I was very happy with my physical fitness. And we were very focused on training well for this marathon. I did the training very diligently. I mean, I followed the protocol, didn't skip any runs. I mean, it was great. And then I got to the marathon. I ran the marathon. I succeeded. And then for like the next year, I let myself get back out of shape. So that's his point in the book, is that, the goal is actually breaking a long-term progress. Because if instead my goal, if instead my focus were on the system, which is to do all the things I just talked about, after I completed the goal, I would have continued my system and I would not have allowed myself to get out of shape, right? So it's not to say that goals are necessarily bad things. It is to say, however, consider emphasizing the goal less and emphasizing the system more. So going back to, again, so he started with atomic habits. So just kind of to summarize this whole section, atomic habits, James Clear says, are the building blocks of remarkable results. They're small, easy things to do that build up over time and accumulate, dividends over time. He also says, and I really like this. This is one of my favorite quotes from the book. He says, "You do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems." So the next thing to sort of go into transition into now is to talk about change. Okay, so we've established that it's better to have atomic habits. We've established that it's better to focus on system rather than goals. But so what? Now, what do we do with those, right? So how do we change? How can we implement better habits in our lives, getting rid of the old habits, which is really, really hard, implementing the new habits, which is really, really hard, right? How do we do it? So I'm going to propose a couple of things, but first I want to talk about sort of change itself. And this is also from Atomic Habits. He talks about change. So let me give you guys a little prompt here. I'm going to ask everybody a question. And this is one for you guys to try and answer. The question is, let's hypothetically say that I am a smoker. Okay, I don't smoke, but let's just say hypothetically that I'm a smoker. And you offer me a cigarette. And I look at the cigarette and I look at you and I say, no, thank you. I'm trying to quit. Okay, that's the first scenario. The first scenario is you offer me a cigarette. I say, no, thank you. I'm trying to quit. Scenario B is I'm a smoker. You offer me a cigarette. I look at the cigarette. I look at you and I say, no, thanks. I'm not a smoker. Between scenario A and between scenario B, which one do you think is going to be more successful in not smoking going forward? And that's exactly it. And the science behind it, right? So the science he's referencing in this part of the book basically shows exactly that, right? It goes to when we change our identity. And I'm going to get to this here in a minute, but really what it comes down to is a change in identity, right? So notice the words, I am not a smoker. Now, the truth is in this scenario, the person that was offered to me, the person that was offered the cigarette was a smoker, right? And so when I say I am not a smoker, I'm not actually lying because I have changed my identity, right? I used to be a smoker, but I'm not anymore. And so when I say I'm not a smoker, I'm not lying. And I'm also, just as all of you have pointed out, creating a completely different environment in my mind than the other, right? So, and change is hard. And he says that change is hard for two reasons. He says the first reason that change is hard is that, we try to change the wrong thing, right? And in this case, the person who's trying to quit smoking is trying to change their behavior, but that's the wrong thing. What the person needs to change is their identity, right? He also says that the second reason for the change is hard is because we try to change habits in the wrong way. And that I'll kind of get to next week when we talk about actually building new habits and changing our habits. But what we're going to focus on today is the thing about changing the wrong thing. So there are 3 levels of change, and I really like this model. So I want you to imagine sort of 3 concentric circles. And I didn't put this on a graphic because I've got 2 different sets of 3 concentric circles that I want to show you today. And I didn't want to confuse the two. So for this one, I'm not going to have a visual. So I'm just going to rely on your imagination. So I want you to imagine 3 concentric circles, okay? And the outer circle, we're going to call that outcomes. The inner circle, we're going to call that process or systems, right? So Maria referred to process. I was talking about systems, same thing. So that middle circle is process or systems. and the inner circle is our identity, right? Now, the outer circle, which is outcomes, that equates to goals, right? So we can try to change our goals, right? I'm going to run 1 mile, I'm going to run 10 miles, or I'm going to go from not running at all to running somewhat, or I'm going to go from eating a pack of Oreos a day to half a pack of Oreos a day, whatever that outcome is, right? Outcomes, you can certainly try to change the outcome, and there's nothing wrong necessarily in trying to change the outcome, right? It works for some people. The French fries, yeah, that's another one of my weaknesses. It works for some people, doesn't necessarily work for everybody. But that is one option, is to try to focus on the outcome itself. Possibly a second best option, or a better option, would be to go into that middle circle and focus on the process, right? So instead of trying to not eat the Oreos, instead what I'm going to do is I'm not going to buy the damn Oreos at the store to begin with, right? So my process change is I don't buy the Oreos, right? And then maybe to take that a step further is when I walk into the grocery store, I'm not even going to walk into the aisle that contains the Oreos, right? So my new process is I avoid that aisle in the store altogether, right? So that is certainly something that you can change that will have a result. But the inner circle, so that I said that is identity. So identity equates to beliefs. It is what I believe about myself. It's what I believe about my environment, right? Now, there are two approaches. If you start with the outcome, you can change, you can eat the less Oreos, and then you can try to avoid the Oreo aisle in the grocery store, and then you can get into the center of the circle and try to be a healthy eater. And that may or may not work. But the more effective approach, he says, is to start from the inner circle and work your way out. So don't bother with the process of whether or not you're going to go to that aisle of the grocery store. Instead, tell yourself and create the belief within yourself, I am a healthy eater, right? Part of the reason that you probably eat the Oreos to begin with is because you don't have that belief. You have the belief that maybe I'm a bad eater, or maybe you have the belief I have no willpower, or maybe you have the belief I'm the type of person that needs sugary foods in order to help me get over my depression, my anxiety, my upset, or whatever it is. We have all these different identities that we build that lead to the process and the habit, the process and the outcome of eating the Oreos. Instead, much more effective is to start in that inner circle and say, I'm a healthy eater. I am a person who is thoughtful about what I put in my mouth. I am a person who cares about my body. I am a healthy person. And we will get to how do you actually create that change in identity, right? But really the point is that is way more effective than trying to do it from the outside in. So changing your identity. Okay, so how do you change your identity? Well, actually, before I get to the how part, at this point, I am going to share my screen. And I am going to show you another set of concentric circles. And this time it's going to be a different, slightly different topic. So here we go. Can everybody see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. So just a minute ago, we talked about the 3 concentric circles being the 3 layers of change, okay? In this case, I want to talk about identity specifically. So I'm narrowing into that inner circle that we called identity, and I want to talk about there are 3 layers of identity. And at this point, by the way, this is no longer from James Clear. This is no longer from the book I've been referencing. This is from a different source. But I also really enjoy this model. So this is talking about what is our identity? How is our identity formed? So if you want to change your identity, if you want to be the person who is a healthy eater, or if you want to be the runner, or if you're trying to write a book and you're having trouble writing a book, how do you create the identity of I am a writer, right? I am a writer who is going to write a book, whatever it is that you're trying to do. In order to be able to adopt that identity, it is helpful to understand what is identity. How do we get the identity that I have now? Because we all have a current identity. Where did that current identity come from? And there are 3 layers to it. Sort of this outer layer of the circle is what we call cultural identity. Our cultural identity comes to us basically from the environment, our race, our gender, all of these sort of attributes that we can't change about ourselves are part of this cultural identity. So for example, myself, I grew up in El Paso, Texas. My mother is of Mexican descent. My father is of German descent, and my father's family had been in America for a long time. So my cultural identity is I'm effectively half Mexican, half American, right? The food that I ate growing up was from the two cultures, right? The degree to which we had family, the degree to which we prioritized family was different on both sides. So I have all these different sort of cultural things that I grew up with, right? So El Paso is a mountain town in the desert. And so that environment that I grew up in is part of my cultural identity, right? I'm a male. That's part of my cultural identity. So then you have sort of the next layer in, which is what we call borrowed identity. Now, borrowed identity is something that you can control, where you can't necessarily control your cultural identity. You can sort of pick and choose elements from what we call this borrowed identity. So borrowed identity is what comes to us from experiences, right? It is the things that our parents taught us. It's the things that we got from our teachers. It's the stories that we tell ourselves. It's all the elements of our identity and personality that we have basically adapted from the outside. So I'll give you an example, and I referenced this on the previous call. So part of my transition here to becoming a life coach. So I'll share this with you guys. Some of you already know this story, but I was a corporate person before. I was an executive in big corporations for many years, and I was a finance person in college. I started out pre-med. I was always a very quote unquote left-brained, analytical, black or white type of a person. That was my quote unquote identity, my borrowed identity. I also, because of that, I believe myself to be not creative. Okay, now it's only been in the last couple of years that I've realized that that was completely wrong. But I have never been able to express myself creatively. I've never been successful in being creative because of this borrowed identity that I had, that I was an analytical, left-brained person, right? And so I'd like to tell that story. And at some other time, I'll give you, if you go listen to the replay from last week's call, which is on YouTube, if you do a search for Think Better with Dale Shover, you'll find my YouTube channel, and the video is posted there. I tell more details about that story and how the epiphany that I had when I realized that this non-creative aspect of my personality turned out to be a bunch of bullshit, frankly, and it was just a borrowed identity, right? So that's what I mean by borrowed identity. It's the stuff that we believe about ourselves that we get from some experience or from something that we were told. And then you get to the really good stuff. The blue circle in the middle is your true identity. Okay, this is who you really are. At the end of the day, when you put aside all the crap, when you take all the programming away from yourself, when you remove all the cobwebs that are clogging up your brain, and you look at who you really are, what really turns you on, what your values are, what gets your motor running, the juicy stuff on the inside that gets the blood flowing, the stuff that makes you happy and sad, that is your true identity. And what we, sometimes forget is we forget that true identity because of all of the shit that we have on these other two circles around us that are constantly in conflict with our true identity, right? So it is helpful to understand this. I skipped this part. I do have some other examples of borrowed identity. So stuff like, I'm terrible with directions. Just like my, I'm not creative. So people say I'm terrible with directions. I'm not a morning person. This is a very common one, right? We all know somebody who says I'm not a morning person, right? I'm bad at remembering people's names. That's when I tell myself quite a lot, actually. I'm always late. These are all borrowed identities, right? The beauty of it is that it's not true. It's not in the blue circle, right? If it's not in the blue circle, feel free to dismiss it. And so it is, and it's not as hard as you think that it is. So now you can kind of see we're coming full circle now, right? So if I want to be the person who doesn't need to worry about avoiding the cookie aisle in the grocery store, I need to remove this nonsense about I have no willpower, or that I'm not a healthy eater, which is borrowed, right? Or potentially cultural. Remove that. And in my blue circle, tell myself that I am a healthy eater. So, and really, and that's an amazing result. And he gives in the book, a lot of examples of like sports teams and individuals who have really sort of upped their game just from tiny, small, incremental changes. And the beauty of looking at it in this way is that no one can say genuinely that they can't improve by 1% in a period of time, right? Now, it doesn't have to be in one day, right? It could be 1% in a week, right? It could be 1% in a month. But to say that that is an intimidating thing, or that it makes you feel overwhelmed, or that you can't do it, is nonsense, right? Everyone can say that they can make a 1% improvement over time. So all you have to do is you have to get out of your mind that you need to see big, huge results immediately. Because you really don't. Like, nothing in life is ever like that, right? We don't get any big, huge result from one day to the next. So if I think about it instead, and by the way, that's also very intimidating, right? So I ran a marathon when I was in my 20s. Okay, so I'm about to have a big birthday coming up, and I've told myself I'm going to celebrate my big birthday, I'm going to run another. In this case, it's going to be a half marathon. Now, I've started training, in the last couple of weeks, but I know that there's no way I'm not going to go do even an 8-minute mile in the next couple of weeks. It's just not going to happen, right? And I'm not even going to set my mind to that. What I am going to do is I'm going to say, if I can just improve my mile by 25 seconds, fourth of a minute, if I can improve my mile by 25 seconds, that's all I care about. The other thing too, if you're a runner, you kind of know, when you start to get tired, and like, let's say you're running in the neighborhood, one thing I'll do is, I know I have in my mind I want to run 5 miles, 2 miles, or whatever it is. I start to get tired, so I say, oh, I'm going to run to the stop sign at the end of the street. And you put anything beyond that out of your mind, and you just say, I'm going to run to the stop sign. You get to the stop sign, say, okay, now I'm going to run to the next stop sign, right? So this is something we all know. This is no big genius thing, but we do tend to forget about it, and so it's easy. It makes life a lot easier. And what I'm here to help you to do is to keep that stuff top of mind, right? So you can, and like I've said on every call so far, is think of your mind like a muscle, right? The things that we're talking about here on this call are really just mindset things, right? It's very easy for me to know cognitively that running to the stop sign is a better way of succeeding at running, but we forget about it. But you don't have to. So my point is that if we just exercise our mindset for better thinking, then that will come naturally, right? So all the stuff that you're talking about that's cluttering you, that's keeping you from remembering that all you got to do is run to the stop sign, that's just a function of, like anything else, you can work that out of the muscle, right? By repetitive exercise. Okay, so the last little bit here is I want to talk about, okay, so how do we change our identity? So there's really, it's really actually fairly simple in concept, a little bit harder maybe in practice. But think of it as a two-step process to changing your identity, right? It really is as simple as decide who it is that you want to be. And I recommend for everybody that you put some thought into this, because it's not necessarily easy to come to, right? And there is actually a whole exercise that I could take you through that helps you sort of figure out, what type of person you want to be. I'll give you a clue though, where it starts with values, right? So it is a very helpful exercise. It's actually a very therapeutic exercise, and it's a very motivational exercise to every couple of years, or maybe even every year, is sit down for some reflection and think about what's important to you. Think about what your values are. And then, take those values and translate them to the personality traits, the characteristics that you want to have as your identity, right? So you need to really decide what type of person you want to be. So for me, heading toward my birthday this year, I'm going to be a runner. That's going to be one of my things. I'm going to be a runner, right? Also, part of my identity is, as I told you guys, I'm now a life coach. That is my identity, right? I'm a runner. I'm a life coach. I'm a creative person. These are things that I have implemented recently for myself as part of my identity. I have eliminated this left brain bullshit attribute that pervaded my life for the last, I'm not going to tell you how many years. But now I am a creative person. So spend some time thinking about and deciding what is the type of person you want to be. And then once you've established that, you now start with the atomic habits, right? So now start implementing the behaviors and the habits that are going to prove to yourself that that is your identity, right? So for me, it's going to be, like I said, improving my mile run time by 25 seconds, right? And I think I said that was going to be like every week. So every week I'm going to make a 25 little tiny thing. That is part of me proving to myself that I am a runner. So that's how you do it. more to come next week. Next week, we'll talk about the actual habit building part. So I'll give you 4 kind of steps to building better habits that are all basically going to be basically be based on the material that we've talked about today. So, once you have established your new identity, and you're working on the small wins, so you're working on step number 2 here. So I'll give you 4 steps to kind of help you with that part of the process. So the homework for you guys is to spend a little bit of time over the next week. Think about the things that you want to change about your identity. Don't think about your behaviors. Don't think about your processes. Think about who you are, that blue circle on the inside. Who do you want to be? What makes you get up in the morning and be excited? Think about that. And then come back to me next week and we'll talk about habits.